Hello, my name is Azucena Carrasco and I am here with Greg Tosh. Hello Greg, how are you?
Hi, it's me too.
So we're here in a lovely setting and lovely music and lovely chat that we just had, and we want to continue because we want to hear about Greg's history and all that he can tell us about what it was for him working in council or local government. What it was for you, Greg?
Yes. I must admit I have thoroughly enjoyed my total career.
How did you come across?
I started right from the ground up. First job was with Chinchilla Shire Council as a paymaster cost clerk, and it was a great opportunity to learn the whole workings of a local government in terms of seeing the outside guys working on the roads and getting to pay them on our paydays, to the inside of doing the costings for all the various jobs, and then also getting that grounding in financial background and also the governance aspects of local government.
But you've spent most of your career in Logan, is that right?
That's right. I actually, interesting scenario there. I was actually Logan's first employee.
Oh, really?
Back in April 1979. The council got elected. They held their inaugural meeting, and the mayor then rang me, I think it was on a Thursday, to advise that, well, they were getting fully operational. At the time we only had Gary Keller, who was an advisor from the Department of Local Government, to assist the council getting set up, because they had to be fully operational on the 1st of July 1979. And so we had to look at things like buying getting administrative headquarters, setting up a rate system, just generally trying to combine the records of what was formerly the Albert and Beaudesert Shire councils. And in that time, they were meeting nearly like every day of the week, and no one was taking the minutes. So at the time, I was a minute clerk at Beaudesert Shire Council and had applied for a role as a minute clerk with the new Logan City Council, on Logan Shire Council then. And I received this phone call from the mayor, Councillor Darryl Bryant, on the Thursday, and he said, "Oh, we needed you to start work yesterday, Greg, but can you start on Monday?" So I literally was on the spot and more or less thought, well, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth, and I accepted the challenge. And on the Monday morning I started up at what was then the Logan Shire Council headquarters, which was the now the art gallery next door to the Logan City Council chambers in Wembley Road. And it was this little meeting room at the back of the art gallery, which was the northern area office for Albert Shire Council at the time. And there I was. I met Gary Keller, but Gary unfortunately was more involved with just the administrative side of things. So here I was, thrown in the deep end to be the minute clerk for meetings, and this council were trying to operate as a full functioning council, even though officially they were still having Beaudesert and Albert were still in a caretaker role. They were setting their policies for what they saw they wanted in the future. And one of the most interesting scenarios I recall was sitting through one day where the new Logan Shire Council thought they needed to interview all the applicants for any roles with the new Logan Shire Council. And I can remember one day sitting there through this meeting as these 10 they were aldermen in those days, sat around the table, and even for little junior secretarial jobs, they used to get the poor applicant to come in and they sat there, and I always recall a good friend of mine, Lee Shahada Jones, and she was saying, I'm only applying for a secretary's job, I'm not applying for the CEO's role. But it went the same way round the table. It just goes to show the changes in recruitment processes.
Now it's normal.
Yes, yes.
But it wasn't at the time.
No,
To go through an interview.
Yes, yes.
Right.
And I can recall friends who were town planners from the Desert Shire that I'd worked with down there, and here it was, they were being questioned by these 10 aldermen, I think they were at the time, because it was alderman and a mayor and a chairman and alderman. And they were then asked silly questions like, oh, and what does your father do? And one of the young town planners said, oh, my father's a general practitioner. That'd make a good town planner.
Kind of
So he immediately got the job. So in hindsight, in all due deference, we had the ways it used to be.
Yes.
Back in the, I suppose, as I said, 1979.
So you must have seen all the progress towards a very structured recruitment process now.
Oh, absolutely. And having studied that when I was going to uni in the late 90s and 2000, and it's a side of my life that I quite enjoy, the human resource management side of things, that I found that, yes, due process and what you follow these days versus how it was done back in that time.
Is that a real improvement? What do you think?
It's hard to say. All I know is that through whatever process, those guys that did take up the challenge in Logan early days have really set the course of making quite an innovative great council. And if you follow the career paths of some of those guys at that time, they have gone on to become CEOs and have pursued really interesting careers where they're now directors of different departments of various other councils throughout Queensland, and have done well. And Logan itself, I feel, is a very much a leading edge council in its management and administration.
That's fantastic, because you've retired only 2 years ago.
Yes, yeah.
Do you miss it?
Wonder how I ever used to fit in work, but I guess I've always been one to remain socially in the game, and I love just remaining socially active, I guess, is my thing. I'm watching it from afar, and sadly enough, in some ways, I'm a little bit sad for my former colleagues of what's been happening in our council. But besides that, I really appreciate what the LGMA have done in furthering and doing sponsoring young managers to come up through the ranks.
Yes.
And I suppose one of the highlights of my life was representing a team from Logan at the LGMA challenge.
The management challenge, yes.
And I actually, that year, we ended up getting second placing.
The awards.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And
You've got some news clippings. That is fantastic. Thank you.
And that was the team I was with. But we'd won the Queensland, represented Queensland at the national finals, and apparently we came in second at the final. And,
very well done.
And to this day, those other team members we've all remained close. It's been a great bonding thing for us, and we've sort of like basically stayed in touch, and there's been some interesting
of course, because it keeps you motivated.
I think it's one of LGMA's great courses of if they can keep pursuing that, because it's that hands-on scenario situation under pressure, which is what local government's all about.
We try to lift the game.
That's right. Yes, absolutely.
And so that was one of the highlights of your career, you would say?
Oh, yeah. As I said, it was the challenge of being at Logan in those early days has been immeasurable to me in my career, in that I've probably stayed with Logan then all that time, but along the way I was going up the ladder. I did I was working in the administrative side. I then took a little sabbatical from council in 1990 for about 13 months, because at the time my wife wanted to go into private enterprise, so I sort of became Mr. Mum for that 13 months.
Yes,
and at the end of that time, I was then offered a role to help run the referendum, I think it was, in 1991, to help John Oberhart, who was one of our leading deputy CEOs at Logan, and he was doing the election but also the extra work involved, so I came on the project to help that. From that I ended up going back to council permanently in 1991, and I worked then in the Department of Health and Environment and Planning, which opened me up to a whole new hands-on section of council. It was in that role I effectively was managing a team of about 13 people, which to some degree was a forerunner of a customer service centre, because the types of things that health departments manage is your rubbish, your animal registrations and management, advertising signs, licensing, food premises, which exposed me to a hands-on of the operations of a health department and local authority. So and one of the, I suppose, the big challenges there is dealing with a team of, I think it was 13 odd staff who were manning the phones and trying to manage the tensions between, because it's surprising how ratepayers get so intense about their rubbish bin not getting picked up in the morning, and so our poor staff were the first point of call. And so as a result, they would have to feel this very, very irate person that didn't get their rubbish
it's
bin
daily
emptied.
Things.
It is. It's the hands-on.
Council deals with daily things for
And
people.
it was one of my funny observations about, at the time, I guess we basically had a team of females, and yet my immediate sort of the supervisor in charge of that 13 odd staff, she probably knew more about the job than I did, yet say the staff member would get something, that's how they want to speak to her supervisor, they'd then speak to that supervisor, who was a very competent lady who just knew her stuff like you wouldn't believe, but yet then they'd insist that they'd want to speak to a man.
Oh,
and believe it or not, this
that
is where,
was happening at the time.
Oh yeah, this was only in the 90s that the community, sadly enough, even though we sort of think we've moved, was still had this thing that no, talking to a female didn't carry any weight. It had to be a man. So,
well, yeah, it's something that I could see from council's point of view when I was interviewing Stephanie Houghton, and she was the first female in a managerial position up Pine Rivers, and she was saying that it was quite a challenge to work at the time.
Oh yeah.
But it is also good to see from the outside council's point of view that it was not only a culture that it was in council, it was a general culture.
Yes.
In terms of women not being regarded as equal as men.
Yes. Yeah. Diverting from that, an interesting scenario is when I was managing that team in the health department. One of the clerical officers at the time we were having some issues with, and would you believe, when I spoke to her, my take on the whole situation was that this officer really wasn't the correct fit for the job, that she wanted to do something more than just be a clerical officer taking data to put into a computer. She wanted to solve the issue and change policy, and I basically had recommended that I think she was in a career crisis situation and was going to refer her to our the council interlock services to go to get some counselling on what she wanted to do with her career. And believe it or not, she ended up leaving council, but then stood for the next council elections and became a very successful councillor.
Oh, that is such a good story.
and then, would you believe, became a very, very successful mayor of our council. So,
right.
And she served 2 good terms there and left Logan in a very, very strong position, and was I felt a really good story around women rising above the glass ceiling. But at the time, I think she was frustrated in that she wanted to aspire to higher things, but through whatever means, she has managed to
Definitely.
Yes.
Jump the fence.
Yes, yeah. And so that's been an interesting part of my role, I
Something
guess.
that you have witnessed.
Yes,
And which is a very good story.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
very inspirational.
Yes. Oh, yes,
For candidates.
Yeah, and it's that whole story of, I suppose, whilst you receive your challenges when you're managing staff, there are those tensions that exist between the role of the boss, I suppose, as you'd call it, and what's expected of the employee. But it's also then applying those other soft skills and trying to get to the reason behind what makes people tick.
Yeah.
And it does get down to square pegs in round holes. And it's a matter of then guiding those people into the areas where they want to be. And I suppose
To meet expectations.
it is. It's sort of, as I said, at the time I learnt a lot about the recruitment process, because I think in that particular instance, this particular employee, we employed her on the basis of exceptional typing stenographic skills, because that's what we were sort of looking at in the job. But then it was when she was in the job which possibly didn't fulfill her true needs,
Yes.
that then she became sort of somewhat not a team player, and so consequently there was this little tension that existed there. But then finally then to see change happen, and sometimes it's a hard decision to sort of then basically cause somebody to say, no, you can't do that, but then they're stuck in a role that they're not happy with.
Exactly. It's a crossroads.
And it's I guess you do not get the 100% out of somebody if they're not enjoying what they're doing.
I guess that she had to decide whether she was meant to fit in or stand out.
Yes.
And
yes.
she made the right decision for the look of it.
In for local government, and I think the ratepayers of Logan, I think to some degree were sad to see her leave, you know, but unfortunately leave council from the angle of mayor, but at the same time She was somebody that always had integrity and was always one of those to go that extra mile.
Fantastic.
And, yeah,
Have you seen many of those throughout your career?
Yes, I have actually. I mentored a young cadet local government clerk way back in the 80s. And this young guy, fair enough, he's still not in local government, but basically taking him through the basics of just letter writing, report writing, but encouraging him to take initiative and to not necessarily getting too pedantic with little minor sort of grammatical errors in his letters, but more encouraging him to develop a flair. It was sort of like I encouraged him to just exercise that initiative and just give him the responsibility to do stuff. And as a result, he's gone on and, well, now he's, an international consultant with, firms analysing their computer installations and what have you. And, yeah.
Would you say that it was because of the training and the mentoring that he received?
I would like to think so.
It's a part of it, isn't it?
Logan at that time, I felt, was a great organisation all around. We had a brilliant CEO in the likes of Gary Keller, who just had that an amazing intellect, and he was ahead of his time in so many ways at setting up Logan. I thought legally we were lucky in that we were able to start from scratch, and going up through that scenario, he basically was someone who was revered throughout the industry as being this incredible mind that was able to, I suppose, get through changing local government. Was sort of starting to happen at that time. It was sort of breaking away a little bit into that business model where we're heading now, that local government's got to be accountable and what have you. And but Gary,
that doesn't mean that wasn't accountable before.
No,
not necessarily.
But he did set up very strong culture of accountability and governance, and those structures I felt were very much essential, because it was all at the time of the 80s with the trying to think of it, the Fitzgerald inquiry, where there was that corruption thing was starting to happen, and everything did need a huge overhaul. And it was sort of like Logan, I felt, through that, came out of that rather unscathed, on the grounds that we had this strong legal backing, that there wasn't that bending of the rules that seems to have crept in.
Were you part of that success in terms of accountability and transparency, probably?
Yeah, like, it was interesting times. I remember sitting through a council meeting back in the very second council of Logan, I think it was in 1982, where the council had this divided team. We had, whilst there's no politics in Logan effectively, we did have 5 Labor members got elected, and we had 5 independents. And in that time, we only had the 10 councillors, and they had to elect a chairman from their own. Well, I think they were then a city, so I think it then became aldermen. And at the time, couldn't agree, because they had to elect from within their 10, so they had 5 for, 5 against. And they had to have this statutory meeting process where they had to just keep meeting every 2 days or something. It was a strange thing with the Act, but anyway, eventually they got the minister had to step in and make an appointment, because they could never agree.
They could not agree.
Therefore, that's when the Act got changed, and Then Logan then got the mayor elected at large, so that we would never have that situation in the future again, where you have councillors having to then to elect a mayor from within. The mayor got elected without. These are, I suppose, are the things that have advanced in local government over the years.
What can you see in the future of how councils are being run now? Like, for example, with the culture of accountability, now probably it is much more equal in terms of the amount of female and males, and probably fairer. How would you describe that the progress of council, and what future can you anticipate?
There definitely has to be some huge changes made.
We're not there yet.
Just in the light of what seems to have transpired in just recent times since I've left, effectively, the very fact that my council has got the situation at the moment where it doesn't have an official CEO, it's only got an acting CEO.
Yes.
And there's these clouds over that separation of powers between the elected body and the administrative body that has to go about the daily, the CEO managing his operations.
Yes.
There is this thing now through that the changes in the Local Government Act. This is only my opinion, but that thing of giving that power to the mayor to more or less control things, and as we're seeing this thing of CEOs being paid out their contracts and things like that for failure to perform and what have you, one begins to wonder when you're then hearing the suspicion, and there are only allegations of corruption, and the whole issue around developers meeting with the councillors and mayors and getting things approved until such time as, I guess, the CJC or the CCC get to fully have that investigated. And sadly enough, we're in this grey period at the moment.
If you were a consultant
Yeah.
and asked to give some recommendations about how to improve local government, would that be one of them?
Oh, absolutely, and that whole issue around donations to election is
I think it should be regulated, strongly regulated.
It has to be, because there is just so much influence that now you're getting from these, and it appears, you look at them, they're overseas developers coming in with big money, and sadly enough, it's got to be regulated. And the whole thing is that if you get enough money behind you and you're the mayor of the city, effectively any of those that are standing on the platform of doing the right thing will just never get elected, because money does win elections, I feel. It's probably an oversimplification of the whole matter, but I just felt that there's, the fact that corruption is allowed to exist, and until such time as that's wiped out somehow and gets back to the grassroots person that stands, that wants to do the right thing by the people. And I look at, in a past life, that used to be the thing. In the country community where I first started work in Chinchilla, it was, all the councillors were sort of like the pillars of your society.
Yes, okay.
In that community, in a past life, and they got elected because of developing a good name, being a good grazier,
working with the communities and being involved.
Involved
probably
in, say, the Rotary Club, and
Yes.
involved with this and that and what have you. And so consequently they were then given the voice by the people in the election process.
You think it was more accurate when they came from small communities and were involved with those communities to
Yes.
be able to bring actually their voices to
Yes,
government.
yes, yeah, and I'm still saying there are still elected reps that are still got that right attitude now and are genuine about just trying to make society a better place and doing their bit. And I admire people that want to step into that political arena, but until such time as you can get it separated that it's not money, that it's the election campaigns
Yes.
that can guarantee, if you've got lots and lots and thousands of dollars in the kitty to throw at an election and get you elected, sadly enough then you then are open to that. People seem to want to...
You open a door.
You're opening the door and they're sort of saying money talks, as it were. So till that one's resolved, I think that we've got to have, and there's going to have to be some major, I think, amendments to the Act in terms of what's happened, say, in the likes of Ipswich and these other councillors that are being subjected to this corruption sort of inquiries happening at the moment.
Yeah. Well, you are quite knowledgeable about council, not only because you have devoted your career to it, although I've heard that he actually was a musician before, took his time before he went into local government.
Yeah.
Did you bring some music to local government?
Well, I can recall my very first Christmas party at Logan. My CEO, Gary Keller, who's also a brilliant bass baritone singer.
Really?
And we ended up doing a skit at the very first Christmas party. I think he was...
there wasn't Facebook at that time, so we don't have anything to look at, a picture, a video.
But it was one of those very first Christmas parties that we were only been operating 6 months, and so the staff were just very excited. We were also very exhausted because we were just working such long hours in those days, just to maintain keeping the doors open, getting things happening, because Logan was exploding business-wise at that time. So it was work hard, play hard. But I can recall Gary and myself. I played the keyboard, and he did this little skit with the guy that was the senior records officer. I think he was a bit of a singer as well. So
fantastic!
Yeah, and my CEO Gary composed this little ditty about Logan, and it went down like really great. So.
Not only he brought his skills and music to local government, but also you actually married your wife. She was working for another council.
That's right.
What were your conversations at home, I wonder?
At the time, Deb, believe it or not, was a ward office executive assistant to a councillor in Brisbane City Council. And when we first met, it was I think it was about the 1994 elections, and both of us had just, I was working at the Logan elections, Deb was working for her council in the Brisbane City elections. And I guess we just had a lot in common, about her exposure to local government, and I often sort of thought that her working for an elected rep versus mine in more the administrative side of things, how her knowledge of what the ratepayers were seeing as things that were issues which they were going to their elected rep about, versus me dealing it from purely administrative. Definitely got me to expand my mind about the whole operation.
So you actually helped each other?
Oh, we did actually, yeah. Like through that, Deb ended up then, after a couple of years, going into doing work on putting in a new call centre for Brisbane City Council, and through that,
is it the current one?
Yeah.
No,
it's now been upgraded.
Okay.
But she became sort of like a business analyst in sort of through her knowledge gained from hearing what the community and the political arm were wanting, she was able to influence that call centre in scripting their discussions around what ratepayers were really wanting, versus sometimes when you're just working in the inside,
Yes.
you're not understanding what it is the community wants.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, Deb and I guess probably have got that broader
Of course.
knowledge
Of course.
of hearing that. And I think myself working in the health department in that time at Logan also exposed me to what people saw as issues, versus sometimes we can sit in our ivory white towers and think that this is what they need, but it's not necessarily what solves the problem.
Well, if you had to make recommendations for people aspiring to work for local government, what would be your advice?
You have to have empathy, but you also have to have a pretty thick skin. And believe it or not, I look at different industries, and government or any government body, when you're working for them, you just have to have that approach that when people call you, you've got to try and provide them with the facts to solve their issue, but then you've got to go beyond. And a part of my role in more recent years, I became a public interest disclosure coordinator for the council, and that is another one, that whistleblower issue, when you've got approaches from people who have this so-called feeling that there's a suspicion of corruption, then being able to negotiate with the person, the whistleblower, to try and say, yes, the suspicions are grounded, and then setting in place how you go about getting that solved. You've got to walk that very fine line of, everyone, when you start doing your investigations, knowing that investigation process, and I suppose this is my internal audit sort of side of me coming in now, is trying to manage the facts, and they just get so muddied, and it gets such a grey area at times, and sometimes people then are not happy about what you...
And talking about growing that thick skin, when did you have to do it? What were the lowest points of your career, or when you actually had serious difficulties?
I had an unusual part of my role was when I was a secretary of a library board. I was appointed at Logan in a role, but part of that role was to be the secretary, which is like a CEO of a board, a joint board between Albert Shire Council and Logan City Council, to manage the library services of the two councils. They thought at the time, when the councils amalgamated and Logan got created, that it was easier to just keep the library services in a board situation, and it operated for about 7 years quite effectively. But then I think the two councils felt they wanted to be masters of their own destinies and set up about where they wanted to put their libraries and what their money was, instead of paying it in and things being divided 50-50 and sort of being administered like, it was a case of developing a plan that if we were doing a new library at, say, Currumbin Waters, we'd need to do a new library out at Marsden in Brisbane and in Logan and Gold Coast. And so consequently, there was that little bit of the two councils were sort of starting to, the Albert and Logan were starting to get their own issues. So it stood to reason that time had come to cut the umbilical cord and go their own separate ways. Unfortunately, I was in this role of secretary of a board, and I had my board members, which were 2 members from Logan, 2 members from Albert, and I had to report to them on the reasons for or against disbanding.
Yes.
And it was very awkward because economically it just was far more viable, economically viable, for the 2 to stay together as one and administer, like to go and buy books. The administration costs of one administration to buy books for 7 libraries was more economical than for 2 councils to do it.
Okay.
Anyway, I put my report up, but then that was in contrast to my CEO in my own council,
Right.
who was advocating we need to go our separate way.
Okay.
And that was just one of those situations I had to ride through, the fact that I had to do for my board members, and yet my CEO was. Yeah.
Yes. I can see the
Just hold
difficulties.
it.
Yes.
Just
Very well. So we have talked about your high and low points of
Yes.
your career.
Yeah,
We have
yeah.
talked about how to bring inspiration and recommendations to people wanting to work in local government.
Yeah.
And now, what do you think about? You were talking about the difficulties, and I wonder if that has something to do with amalgamations and the amalgamations of councils. What's your view on that?
I guess, yeah, I think some have been successful, but there's also, you do have to look at the community of interest with your areas that you're doing. And the classic examples is I look at Noosa, and I think Noosa has done quite well in separating and going back to their own thing. In ways, I think it makes sense in the likes of Logan that we've got more of a better community of interest there than I think in a past life I felt the people of Beenleigh in Gold Coast City Council were somewhat left not being serviced 100%, whereas I feel now that with Logan there's more of a community of interest between Beenleigh and the Logan community in that sort of, like, I suppose, a green belt area, because there's that ability to expand, but then they're just a little bit closer to their areas as opposed to be in a past life when they had the sort of thing coming down here to bundle to deal with their day.
So you think that they are closer connected to the community issues?
It definitely has to be a community of interest thing.
Excellent.
If that works, I think it's good. I go back to my old Logan chinchilla days. I do believe that there are issues out there. They've amalgamated 5 major councils: Taroom, Marilla, Chinchilla, Tara, and Dalby and Wombo, and that's this huge council. But I get the impression that the people out there still regard themselves as the community of Chinchilla and the community of Meandara and the community of Taroom, and there is a lot of dissatisfaction in those little communities, and as to whether they're it has become so huge, but sometimes we need to be connected. I think. Yeah.
So you think that keeping the balance is actually the key to success?
It is, yeah.
Not too big, not too
small. Yeah, I do think, there were some issues around smaller councils in the past life were unviable.
Okay.
But perhaps the process could have been just a little bit slower. But for what it was, the government at the time chose to just force it on everybody, and I still think we're feeling some of the fallout of that.
Okay, well, let's hope for the best.
Let's hope that a little bit of
And in your career, what does it mean, LGMA, for you? What's your experience? I mean, why did you join, and what it represents for you in your career?
Oh, it's the networking. It's
So you were very quick in defining it was the networking opportunities, wasn't it?
yeah, it's that ability to get together at your annual conferences and your little regional conferences from time to time, doing those little small courses and that the forums that they're running now, I sort of think were great opportunities where you meet with your colleagues in the other councils and you're not reinventing the wheel all the time. It's that quick exposure to some leadership inspiration with the speakers you have at those conferences, and learning leading edge experiences of other governments and how other people are doing stuff. And it's immeasurable. It's you can read, you can do all your professional development and what have you, but just to be able to go and talk your war stories out and just give different other perspectives in that less intense work environment, but more on a relaxed, I am sure that people don't realise the advantages
until they go through it and they can see
yeah,
for themselves.
and I can always understand whenever you hear the media talking about councils and their big conferences and their, sadly enough, it's through that things, I think, emerge, innovation happens. It's your exposure to it and you're hearing what's worked and what hasn't worked and what have you, just allows you to come back to your own little environment and
with a different mindset, maybe.
Absolutely. And
Yes.
that's where I think it's management organisations like LGMA have got to still maintain that focus and stay in there
Yes.
to support their members, because the industry has been disseminated like unreal.
Yes.
As you were saying before about the CEOs and people with great depths of knowledge and what have you, and the way the industry is changing and who they're trying to bring in, and the whole career. But at the same time, we are unique. We can't say we're a private enterprise organisation, because we are dealing with spending taxpayers' money. I'm now a pensioner. I'm looking
Yes.
I am looking at that Gold Coast City Council are spending my money wisely.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's balancing that sort of fine line between corruption and having integrity and doing things which is right for the greater benefit of the good of all the people,
Yes.
and not just some of the people. Sort of.
That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
And Greg, this has been a fantastic time and enjoying at your place here in the Gold Coast. Of course, you're a musician, and we had to have the music in the background.
Oh yes.
And one of the other things, and this will be my last question.
Yeah.
I'm not taking any more of your time in this gorgeous
problem.
Queensland
It's
day.
perfect
day.
Gold Day. Perfect Gold Coast Winter's Day. Yeah.
So, one of the things that you like to do on your spare time, and we've got the choppers coming
Yes.
up and down, probably checking traffic.
Yes.
And one of the things that you like to do is traveling. When
Yes.
you travel, do you actually have a look at how the streets are maintained, how connected is council with their residents? For example, if there are enough bins, or how the pavement is looked after. Do you do that when you go traveling?
Believe it or not, yes, Deb and I have just got back from a tour of Western Australia. And it was a bus tour thing we did, but It was interesting. We were up in Darwin, and Deb was commenting on how all these trees were sort of being chopped down and what have you. And then we'd realised that they just had a bit of a cyclone through, not the rest of us around Australia.
Yes.
But suddenly we could see all the issues that had created up in Darwin at the time, and how that community had been relying on the mining industry, and how there's been the downturn in the mining industry. So consequently, Darwin at the moment seems a little bit depressed in terms of, you see the shops empty and things like that, and there's generally an issue at the community. We then went over through the Kimberley, and we ran across places like Fitzroy Crossing and Halls Creek. And there we were hearing the stories of how there were the Aboriginal type communities there, which the towns had become very unsafe to live in because of rioting and what have you, and yet how they've managed to then clean up the cities, and they were very lovely little communities now, very clean, very tidy and what have you. And then we sort of just went through. I remember going through Karratha. Now this is in the mining Pilbara area, and suddenly I saw this amazing entertainment centre that they've just built there. It was magnificent, and Deb and I sort of had a couple of hours where they just let us all free in the town. Well, naturally we walked over to the entertainment centre, which has only just opened. And so consequently, Deb and I just walk our ways in and make ourselves known to the people and say, oh, this is magnificent. And they said, oh, yeah, do you want to have a look through? And we just had it, and we were able to then come back to the tour director and say to her, look, next time you better go and get your people to go through the centre, because it was an arts centre, a beautiful theatre complex, a library, and just a magnificent structure. And it just goes to show how the money from mining has benefited communities, because here it was, you're sort of going into an area which you just think it's out in the middle of nowhere, but yet suddenly they have this beautiful cultural centre, and it was to rival, like, truly my own art centre here at Gold Coast by comparison. It was really quite a magnificent thing. And I used to work for Logan City Council, and we had our own entertainment centre, which is quite a brilliant centre. But it was those sorts of things that I think Deb and my interest in local government,
you can't help but notice.
Both of us went out and we explored, and even with our trips overseas, we were over in Canada a couple of years ago, and again the same thing happened there, that we suddenly were looking at these places from the council perspective, and the big issues they have over in Canada and in New York and around those places with the maintenance of the roads due to the snow and what have you, that there is they say there's two seasons over there, construction and summer, that sort of thing. It's winter when they're trying to sort of keep the roads open versus summertime when they've got to get in and repair all the bitumen and what have you, because the salt that they put on to melt the snow just then wrecks the pavements, and so therefore
all sorts of problems that we don't have here.
Yeah, so here's us looking at, well, this is something Queensland local governments don't have to deal with. And the extremes in temperature, like over in Toronto, there's sort of issues with a lot of the town is underground because of it's built underneath, and the shops and what have you, and the rail and all that, so people can still work during.
Well, Greg, it has been fantastic to hear your stories, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom in local government. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you very soon at one of LGMA events.
I've got to come to the retirees lunch.
We look forward to
last year,
it.
I don't know what happened, but I just couldn't make
this
up one
year,
of them.
we'll see you this year.
You just send me down. I'll definitely try and get.